Hello and welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. We're nearing the end of our in-depth study of the book of Acts of the Apostles. Today we take up Luke's narrative in chapter 25. Recall these last several chapters is just sort of more or less a continuation of a series of stories all related to Paul defending himself and being tried in various places. Recall that Paul is now in Roman custody in Caesarea, which is, by the way, the provincial Roman capital of Palestine at the time. Last time, the Roman governor, Felix, had Paul before his court with a Jewish high priest, Ananias, who Paul didn't recognize, and his lawyer persecuting Paul. Or you might say prosecuting him. Felix adjourned the court without any discussion and decision, awaiting the appearance of the commander of the Roman cohort that had arrested him, but retaining Paul in custody. There he remained for at least 2 years, according to the end of that story, with a change in governors that occurred during this period of time, right before this story takes up today. Porcius Festus is that new governor who was appointed by Nero, according to Roman records, in 60 AD. So that helps give us pretty good date based on Roman records of when we're talking about. Because this event that we're going to read about today starts just a few days there, a few weeks after his appointment. So let's read chapter 25 of Acts, starting in verse 1, reading to the end of the chapter. Reading from the New Revised Standard Version. 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the leaders of the Jews gave him a report against Paul. They appealed to him and requested as a favor to them against Paul to have him transferred to Jerusalem. They were, in fact, planning an ambush to kill him along the way. Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea and he himself intended to go there shortly. So he said, "Let those of you who have the authority come down with me, and if there is anything wrong about this man, let them accuse him." After he had stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. The next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. When he arrived, the Jews who had gone down from Jerusalem surrounded him, bringing many serious charges against him, which they could not prove. Paul said in his defense, "I have in no way committed an offense against the law of the Jews, or against the temple, or against the emperor." But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, asked Paul, "Do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and be tried there before me on these charges?" Paul said, "I am appealing to the emperor's tribunal. This is where I should be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you very well know. Now, if I am in the wrong and have committed something for which I deserve to die, I am not trying to escape death. But if there is something to their charges against me, no one can turn me over to them. I appeal to the emperor." Then Festus, after he had conferred with the council, replied, "You have appealed to the emperor. To the emperor you will go." After several days had passed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to welcome Festus. Since they were staying there several days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a man here who was left in prison by Felix. When I was in Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me about him and asked for a sentence against him. I told them that it was not the custom of the Romans to hand over anyone before the accused had met the accuser face to face and had been given an opportunity to make a defense against the charges. So when they met here, I lost no time, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered a man to be brought. When the accuser stood up, they did not charge him with any of the crimes that I was expecting. Instead, they had certain points of disagreement with him about their own religion, and about a certain Jesus who had died, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Since I was at a loss as how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wished to go to Jerusalem and be tried there on these charges. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of his imperial majesty, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to the emperor. Agrippa said to Festus, "I would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow," he said, "you will hear him." So on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp, and they entered the audience hall with the military tribunal and the prominent men of the city. Then Festus gave the order, and Paul was brought in. And Festus said, "King Agrippa, and all here present with you to see the man about whom the whole Jewish community petitioned me, both in Jerusalem and here, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he had done nothing deserving death, and when he appealed to his imperial majesty, I decided to send him. But I have nothing definite to write to our sovereign about him. Therefore I have brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after we have examined him, I may have something to write, for it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner without indicating the charges against him." Well, as normal here towards the end of this book, Luke writes very well. It's fairly straightforward narrative, but much is, first of all, relative to this governor, who's actually procurator, is a term that you'll see in some texts here. They're using the word governor, named Porcius Festus. He died early in office. Josephus, the Jewish historian, history characterizing him as a competent leader who worked hard to reestablish peaceful relationships with the Jews, according to several scholars, particularly Dr. Robert Wall reviews that in depth. But a delegation of Jewish leaders traveled to Rome fairly early on and presented a list of injustices to Emperor Nero about Festus, trying to win favor with the emperor, and this was around 62 AD. So within 2 years of when this is supposedly occurring, he's in somewhat, or at least the Jews are trying to get him in trouble with the emperor. Governor Festus is very new to the job here at the opening of chapter 25, as we saw. One of his first acts is to visit Jerusalem to reestablish relationships with the Jews that had eroded a lot during the previous governor's period. And that those Jewish leaders, of course, as we saw here, made a report against Paul. They wanted him brought back to Jerusalem so they could kill him, according to Luke's account here. Instead, Governor Felix seemed to see through their ruse and kept him in Caesarea under heavy guard and requested the Jewish accusers come there to the Roman court and testify against Paul at a formal Roman hearing. Felix asked Paul if he wanted to be tried before the Jews in Jerusalem on those charges. But Paul likely said, it's not said exactly, but it's assumed, as Luke so often does in this book, he assumes things that he doesn't say. And we see here a good example of it. So we assume Paul said, no, I'll appeal to Caesar in Rome. a request which Felix actually grants. Several scholars take serious issue here as to why have the Jewish leaders been so persistent in wanting to eliminate Paul without Luke giving us more details of it. Again, there's assumptions there that a lot was known, I guess, by Theophilus or other Roman officials that he's writing to. Some speculate it might be that Paul is still having significant influence on Jews converting to Christianity, and this has the Jewish community upset. We learn, of course, when we studied Paul's writings, which this class has done in depth, that Silas and Timothy are with Paul here while he's in Caesarea, or have ready access to him. We're not exactly sure what that relationship was, but Paul refers to it often in his writings. So he is still ministering while in prison, which we learned about, as I said, in our in-depth studies. Notice nothing has been said here about the Judean Christians, that is James's church or similar churches, offering support for Paul here, or any other church, any other Christian church that's scattered around. Why is Luke not saying something about their involvement? Several scholars ask, and it's a question that's begging of itself, but we have no clues. Notice Paul makes it clear that his reason for asking for a trial before an emperor is not about fearing to die. He says, if I'm guilty of something that I don't recognize and I deserve to die, so be it. I take my punishment, in other words. Most likely, though, scholars suggest it is because Paul is motivated by this prophetic message that he received back there that was referred to a couple of chapters back, that he was to bear witness in Rome. So he's trying to carry out a prophetic message that he has received, that he is to bear witness to Christianity in Rome. And this is one way he can get there. In his appeal, Paul has made it clear, teaches Dr. Matthew Skinner at he's in Minnesota at the Lutheran Seminary there, that he has done nothing that transgressed the Jewish norms or the Torah laws, the temple rules, and he's, to his knowledge, innocent of violating any Roman laws or Roman customs or values. Note carefully verse 11. Paul claims, since there is no basis of their Jewish claims, he cannot be turned over to the Jews to be killed. I therefore appeal to the emperor. That would be Emperor Nero, who ruled from 54 to 68 AD, if we based on this timeline that's been set here by when Governor Felix is there. Scholars do not agree as to whether Paul had this actual legal right for a trial before the emperor. In other words, it's written here as if it's assumed that Paul's just making a logical appeal that he has a right to have. And yet, scholars say, most of them say that we don't find any evidence that anyone in the first century had such a right. It would have been in Judea. One King Agrippa, this King Agrippa and Bernice, Queen Bernice or wife Bernice, by the way, those are brother and sister as well as husband and wife, were informed about Paul's case and Festus's decision, and since he was going on to the emperor, the king, who was more prominent in the area, somewhat looked at like, even though he was the governor of a territory, he carried an extra king title. How much legal authority he had is greatly debated. But anyway, he was better known and referred to either presumptively or by royal title as king. He wants to get involved to hear the case, and it appears that Felix also feels like they would have had some insight. After all, they are secular Jews. Herod and Bernice both have Jewish lineage. So even though they don't practice Judaism, most likely, they are at least have some connections. In the introduction to that trial, still in chapter 25, we learn that Governor Felix clearly recognizes Paul as innocent of any seditious type charges, which is what Rome was most concerned about. And that's why Jews are concerned at what the Jews are bringing up, which are supposed to be theological things, and in some cases they're really not even that. The core case seems to be tied into resurrection, of this concept of resurrection, which was big in the Pharisees, but not in the Sadducees, and it's the Sadducees who reject this, and they're kind of in charge there. We need to appreciate here that both Bernice and Agrippa are secular Jews, scholars say, while Festus is a pagan, Roman pagan. But being appointed by the emperor and so forth, their official religion is not going to be Judaism. So they're racially carry sufficient genetics to be considered secular Jews, but not practicing it religiously. But much of history suggests they are very well informed of what's going on there. Note here that the Jews that are accusing now are the chief priests and the elders. There's not a lawyer mentioned here like there was in the previous read. And that elders, then, that would mean, used that way, scholars say, means the Sanhedrin. That is the ruling court, the Jewish court. They seem to be wanting the king to give them the right to sentence him before their tribunal, that is the Jewish Sanhedrin, rather than through a Roman court. So here we learn a key difference in Roman and Jewish law, notes several scholars. Festus states it is not our Roman culture or custom to hand over anyone before the accused has a chance to be charged and his defense heard in the presence of his accusers in our courts, that is, in a Roman court. So-called, historians say, so-called the fair trial concept of Roman law, which, of course, much of our law is built on. Much of Western law is built around that old Roman court system. Many scholars label this trial before the king, though, as more of a show trial. It's not. In other words, it wasn't something that was in the normal judicial process of Rome. So the fact that it's been thrown in here, it has reasons. The king wants to be involved, for one, and secondly, the governor seems to want a little more. And Luke, as some scholars say, Luke needs a little more to write about here, get a little more excitement here. It was not in the normal legal route, though, to have that step, whereas the others were. In other words, the Jewish trial was legal. The next step, tried before a governor, is legal. But this step, before the king, is not in the process, they say. Sure, they did not miss something, and that is part of one scholar says, and maybe they're just also trying to throw in an extra thing, making sure they're not missing something here. But most people suggest it has more to do with appeasing the Jewish community at the time. After all, Rome wanted those Jews there where they were at, not because of their religion, not because they were special people as far as religion was concerned, but because they were a significant military presence in that region between Egypt and Rome. It seemed they needed, so they throw this step in order to make sure they have a little more information and not exclude the king before they send this man Paul on to the emperor to be tried. Dr. Eugene Boring and some others suggest the way Luke writes here in late 1st century AD is you saw problems for Christianity by fitting into the Roman world and to be a loyal Roman citizen. He said that he and some others, but especially Boring, comments on this as being a very, they think, a very major part of what's going on here. Trusting in the validity of Roman justice, because they think that Christianity will have no justice before the biased Jewish audience, if you will, especially when it's being run by the Sadducees. But in part, the local Roman leaders also have to appear to satisfy the Jewish demands, the Jewish custom, because they need those Jewish soldiers. They do not want, as long as Judea will behave itself and not rebel against Rome, then Rome wants to keep them there. And so there's a certain amount of political games being played here to keep the Jews happy also. So afoot here is the assumption, the assumed understanding, several scholars say, for this idea that Christianity fares better when it's in this period of time, when it is facing judgment before Roman law rather than Jewish law. The problem here is that certain Jews, underlying concept, one scholar says, is that the Jews have a particular vendetta against Paul, which is never fully explicitly laid out. Scholars note that verse 24, Luke has started out, in other words, this concept that kind of started out that back there in chapter 24, that the accusations were being made by his specific against Paul, a specific group of Jews, the Asian Jews, the diaspora Jews from Asia, if you will, and has drifted over the last two chapters to give the idea of Jews in general are against Christianity, against the way. That's a drift that's been happening without it specifically being said, note a couple of scholars. I hope this gives you some idea how some scholars adds a little more to what is a fairly clear writing here to give us some context. And you have a good Bible study, and we'll see you in the next lesson.